which is called the imposter phenomenon, high achieving women, dynamics and therapeutic intervention. This was what broke the surface on imposter phenomenon. It's not a mental health disorder. So a lot of people think it's a mental health issue. It's not a diagnostic. You can't find it in the ICD-9. You can't find it in the DSM. It's not a mental health disorder. It's considered a phenomenon, which is an occurrence worthy of note, an investigation, an unusual event or person or fact that has special significance or is otherwise notable. And Clance and Imes are, the originator of this concept, are very, very adamant that it be called a phenomenon. And the reason why is because they did not want it to be considered pathological, and they did not want people to think that it was a diagnostic condition, it was a medical disorder. But it has become popularized in the world as imposter syndrome. People know it much more as imposter syndrome. So that's why you hear it as such. So the data is about 70% of us experience imposter syndrome. So that's a really large number. And there was actually a recent study in 2020 done by KPMG suggesting that about 75% of women executives experience imposter syndrome. So the numbers are pretty high of people who actually experience this phenomenon. And I think that's why particularly it's important to deal with it, because it has really significant consequences. While it may not be a mental health disorder, there are correlates to mental health issues like anxiety and depression, and really need to be addressed pretty proactively. So what is it? Imposter syndrome is this experience when you are high achieving, successful, have credentials, experiences, competencies, that you don't necessarily feel like you deserve any of the success. And you attribute that success to luck, mistake, an overwork, or as a result of a relationship. You very quickly discount any praise or compliments. You often feel feelings of fear or guilt about your success. And you constantly are plagued by this fear of failing and being discovered as a fraud. You often don't feel very intelligent and often have underlying perfectionistic tendencies, so that everything has to be perfect in order for it to be taken in as an accomplishment or a success, or to be acknowledged by you. Oftentimes, we also engage in this experience of overestimating other people, thinking, wow, look what they're doing, look what they can do, and underestimating ourselves, like, oh my gosh, I'm such a failure in comparison, I'm not doing that well, and kind of create these kinds of compare and despair experiences. And it's often really hard for us to internalize any feelings of success. They're very fleeting. Even if we have a success, a quantifiable, easy to identify success, it's very hard for us to internalize that and be able to understand that's a part of us. And then we often engage in either overworking or self-sabotage to cover these feelings of inadequacy. So there are 4 hallmarks of imposter syndrome. Diligence and hard work, which is this experience of being meticulous and really making sure that everything is perfect and done to the nines, and that you're incredibly hardworking. You like to be known as hardworking. This experience of intellectual inauthenticity, which is often this experience of like dumbing ourselves down in order to make other people feel comfortable and to make sure that everyone is okay with our knowledge base. Charm and perceptiveness. So oftentimes people with imposter syndrome have high EQ, high emotional intelligence, but they often feel like they're just very good at understanding what people want and then manipulating them or getting what they need from them. But they're just misinterpreting their high EQ. And then also this experience of seeking mentorship for the sole purpose of external validation. We all need mentorship, we all need sponsorship, but when you have imposter syndrome, you're solely there for the validation. You're solely getting the mentorship to feel like you're doing the right thing, you're on the right path, that what you're doing is okay. When we have imposter syndrome, we often experience what's called the imposter cycle. So that's when you get a high visibility event, a new experience, something triggering of your imposter syndrome, and then you have performance anxiety. As a result of that performance anxiety, you then engage this experience of overworking, and you beyond engage in hard work, you function at a level that most people do not function at. You function at this excessive level to cover up this fear of fraudulence and make sure that everything is perfect. Oftentimes you then get a performance review, some evaluation of your behavior, what you did, your project, and you get approval. The minute that approval is pretty much out of somebody's mouth, it's forgotten and you're moving on to the next worrisome event or project or thing that you have to do. So there's no internalization of the approval whatsoever. There's also what we call imposter cycle 2. So start again with the triggering event. Instead of then overworking, you then engage in self-sabotage. That self-sabotage for imposter syndrome typically looks like procrastination followed by short, intense bursts of overwork. So because we are high performers, we know how to perform. But when you have, this experience in the imposter cycle 2, you will wait, and then engage in these intense experiences of overwork, like long hours, 18 hours, 20 hours, long, intense bursts of work. Then you get a performance review. Because you've procrastinated or potentially engaged in self-sabotage, sometimes you get approval and then you erase it, or sometimes you get a mixed review, and there's positive and then there's negative. And you take the positive, you discard it, and then you just blow up the negative feedback. That is all you're focused on. That's all you're worried about. That's all you're concerned with. And then you engage in the cycle all over again. So imposter syndrome can impact us differently or can look differently for us. So this is from the research. And so for women, it doesn't prevent women necessarily from achieving, but they do as a result of being what we call counterphobic. So they actually run toward the fear. They go toward the fear. They are constantly plagued by the feelings of fraudulence and constantly exposed to that because they are pursuing the thing that they fear. When women make mistakes on tasks and they're called out, they tend to then overspend time on those particular tasks as a result. They will spend a lot more time on them than someone without imposter syndrome. And they really work very hard around negative feedback. So negative feedback encourages them to work even further and more. Men, on the other hand, and this is not true of every man, but this is sort of globally on average, that men tend to affiliate with less advanced peers with less advanced skills, and they'll aim more toward mastery. They want to make sure that they're king of the hill, make sure that they are the one who's top dog. Even if they could be better and strive for more, they tend to kind of underestimate their capabilities and want to be with people that are much more, they can compete with much more easily. And so they take less risks, and as a result are less likely to pursue certain careers where their imposter syndrome is threatened. Now, for people of color, women, first gen, there's this experience of what we call the double impact. So it's that you're experiencing imposter syndrome internally and all those experiences of fear of fraudulence, fear of making a mistake, overworking. And then on the outside, externally, you are feeling all of these potential and getting all these potential messages that you don't belong here. You potentially are a fraud. Maybe you're an imposter. Maybe you got this role because of a diversity hire. Maybe this, maybe that. And all of these things questioning as a result of systemic discrimination and racism and misogyny. You're getting all these messages that you don't belong, and maybe this place isn't for you. Maybe you took somebody else's place. And this makes it particularly difficult to overcome imposter syndrome, because as a result of that, you're constantly fearing that you might actually be right. You actually might be an imposter because you're getting all these messages from the external world that you are. So some of the research, this is some of the research. So the research on this sadly, there isn't a ton of research. And I meant to say this in the previous slide, but we need more research in this area, and hopefully there will be more research, because there isn't a lot of research on gender non-binary communities, LGBTQ communities, and we need greater research and more depth population studies around sort of imposter syndrome and how it affects us differently. But this is a particular study that's very notable that came out a couple of years ago that showed that Black students with imposter syndrome reported higher levels of anxiety and depression and depression related to perceived discrimination. So they felt greater feelings of depression and anxiety than those without imposter syndrome. And what the study found is that microaggressions, bias, experiences of discrimination can increase your feelings of being an imposter, even when you're not. So this idea is like, you're not an imposter, but it does increase those feelings that you may be when you have these bias and microaggressions. And that imposter syndrome triggering work cultures can exacerbate feelings of imposterism because of the stress, the overwork, and the marginalization. All of those contribute to these feelings. So I think, what's important to understand about the double impact of imposter syndrome is that it is self-reinforcing, and that what's really important in these situations is that, and what the research shows, is that it's really important to find community. And so that's why places like HNBA are so important, and your communities are so important, because they serve as a protective factor from actually really being able to overcome your imposter syndrome. Because as you're trying to do this individually and trying to deal with your imposter syndrome and you're getting all these negative messages, you need to hear other messages from people who look like you, who have similar experiences like you, who have been through it, that no, you're getting gaslighted. No, this is really a discrimination experience that you're having. Like, no, this is real. What you're experiencing is real. And it helps to kind of then validate the experience and also recognize that this is systemic and this is unhealthy, and that internalizing it is only making it worse for you. So community is so central, having mentorship, having relationships that are, kind of vast and rich and like thick. And so I think it's really important, as you think about this meeting, to think about sort of like, what does your community look like, and how do you reach out in these amazing opportunities you have to build community and build a nice, robust community, because it is incredibly, vitally important. If you walk away from nothing else from this presentation, walk away with that community is central to overcoming imposter syndrome. So what are some of the triggers for people who are people of color, who identify as people of color? Well, here are some of them, and they're probably not surprising, but it's experiences of discrimination, of microaggressions, of feeling isolated, like you are the only one or one of few in your organization, a feeling of lack of mentorship, that nobody really wants to mentor you or is mentoring you, or if they're formally mentoring you, they're not mentoring you in a rich and full way, like you see other people getting mentored. Inequitable treatment and access, so feeling like you are not getting treated in the same ways and you're noticing differential treatment, that can be really triggering. And then also gaslighting, so acknowledging something is happening in your environment and then someone saying, that's not what's happening here. And someone erasing and invalidating your experience. These are all really intense imposter syndrome triggers and can make you feel more like a fraud than someone who doesn't have to deal with these things. And so I think it's a really important thing to recognize that when you're experiencing these things, these are also reinforcing your feelings around, being an imposter. So there's a lot of triggers. So the workplace is one trigger, but you also can be triggered by familial expectations, academic places, work systems culturally, all of these things, by managers, which I'll talk about in a second, that can actually sustain your imposter syndrome. And that's why I'm going to talk about this too, about sort of how to identify a trigger and why triggers are so important. Imposter syndrome has been shown in the research to limit your professional advancement. There is data to show that it actually, people with imposter syndrome have reduced knowledge of the job market, so they know less about the possibilities that are out there for them. There's also research to show that oftentimes they misestimate their value to an organization and to the outside world. So they underestimate how valuable they are to an organization or to another community. There's also an increase in institutional loyalty. So oftentimes it's harder for you to leave a job than someone without imposter syndrome because you feel a sense of organizational commitment more than someone else. And there's often a correlation to decreased job satisfaction. So you typically are also less happy in your job than someone without it. It can also impact our academic self-efficacy, as you can probably tell from imposter cycle. If you happen to have imposter cycle too, and you're used to procrastinating and self-sabotaging, it can affect your academic performance. And especially because a lot of the things you do as law students, as lawyers, if you procrastinate and you wait till the last minute, you can't get things done correctly, or you can't pass the bar, or you can't. So it really does affect your efficacy and your ability to create a path for yourself. And I think one of the most important things I think that can affect, can be affected by imposter syndrome is really not ever paying attention to what you want, what you need, what you dream of for your career, really being focused on what other people want for you, what you need to do to be approved of, to what you need to be kind of pleasing to others, and you lose track of what you want for yourself. So being first gen, and I think I use the term first gen pretty loosely. And I use it more probably here to mean first generation in college, first generation to law school, first generation holding a legal role too. There can be a significant pressure to succeed, oftentimes because there are not other models in the family, or the family's relying on you to succeed, to represent for other people, to encourage other family members to be successful. Sometimes you're relying on you for monetary support. So there's a lot of pressure on the success. And then there's sometimes also unrealistic expectations because our families haven't gone to college or to law school. What they expect from us isn't possible. Sometimes they expect us to make a lot of money coming out of the gate, or they expect us to really be able to, to be in some way public, so they want to be able to see you in the newspaper. They might have expectations that aren't realistic, or to do really well in school when you're struggling, to adjust to whatever it might be. So there can be a lot of unrealistic expectations about how to succeed and how successful you should be. And then also not a lot of ways to support your success because they're not sure how to do that. They don't know, they've never been there. So they don't know how to be successful. They're just like, work hard and you'll get there. Not always, it doesn't always work like that. There's also a lack of historical knowledge about the process, about what it takes to be a lawyer, like, how long does it take to become partner? And like, there's no historical knowledge. So as a result of that, there's a lot of like misunderstandings about what's happening in your life and your career and why it's taking you so long, or why you're unhappy and why you're doing certain things. And then also, because also there's a double edge to achievement. So achieving means not only being successful in your family in a way that's often prideful and really kind of exciting, but also it can mean surpassing others. It can mean surpassing economically your parents. It can mean surpassing them educationally, which can have complicated feelings. Like while they're proud of you, they're also somewhat pissed off that you'll say certain things and dismiss them or know more than them. It can cause all kinds of strife that can be really difficult. And then also because they typically believe, because they have limited knowledge of the world of work, they probably have limited knowledge of law. They believe in these very traditional routes to success. And if you don't fit into any of those traditional routes, they think you're failing, or they think you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing, or that you're not going to be successful. So they don't really have a broad understanding of that. And so that sometimes they can call your decisions into question as a result of taking another pathway. And so all of these can lead to putting additional pressure on your imposter syndrome, because sometimes when we have first gen, our parents are, economically fragile and they struggle. So they normalize this experience of overwork because they have to, but then they expect us to work at these same volumes of levels that weren't healthy for them and definitely are also not healthy for us. You fear kind of never being good enough because it's often felt like you were never good enough because of your status or because of where you've come from. And so I think that piece can plague us and follow us. It can be generational because our parents have never felt good enough. We often feel that our success is very fragile, that one mistake could end everything. If we do one wrong thing, make one wrong turn, get a bad evaluation somewhere, that this could be the end. And then there's no potential feelings of safety net. I think also we don't have a lot of role models for our career paths. We can't go look at our uncles, or we can't look at our aunts or our friends of the family and see, oh, this is what people do with a law degree, 20 years out. We don't have those examples in our close vicinity, and we have to sort of make them up or find them in our communities. And that can be a very difficult thing. So we often over rely on the validation of mentors to tell us what to do because we haven't seen it and we haven't seen enough pathways to make a solid decision. We also have this really strong belief that hard work pays off, and we're told by our parents and our relatives to put your head down, you'll get noticed. And oftentimes putting your head down is not the only way to get noticed. It's often with relationships and people knowing each other. And there's all these other ways people advance besides hard work. And these kinds of things can actually perpetuate the concepts of imposter syndrome. So also, work can be also triggering and can perpetuate it. The idea of performance objectives and goals that are constantly shifting. If you never know what your target is, or your target constantly changes, it can make you feel like I can never hit it. Like I'm never good enough because I can never hit the target, but it's not because you can't hit it. It's because it's moving all the time. Work cultures that punish or humiliate mistake making, that can be a massive trigger because you're so afraid to make a mistake because it becomes this public shaming experience that it can make you fraught with the concern that you cannot make any mistakes. Environments where there are stars and scapegoats, so where there are people who are considered the star and people who are considered horrible, and there's no way to recover from that. it's really also really scary. Oftentimes in these environments too, stars can fall from grace, and that's also scary. Like then even if you're a star, you're not even protected. Also environments where there's no boundaries between personal and professional life or academic life, where you're expected to not be able to have a boundary, to set a boundary. Those can be very triggering, because overwork is a function of imposter syndrome. And so if you're being told to overwork and not have a personal life, it can be really hard to manage recovering from it. And then where overworking is rewarded, like the more hours you put in, and you're in a field where billable hours is a really significant thing, overworking can be a part of reward. So the more you work, the more you look like you're contributing, and that can be really a reinforcer of not having good habits and good boundaries, and being able to know when you're not doing well emotionally. So, in my years of doing this work, for the 15 years that I've been in this field and doing this work, I've seen a lot of lawyers. And these are some of the themes that I hear that are most triggering about the legal culture for their imposter syndrome. So the idea of up and out cultures, either you go up the ranks to partner or you get out of here. That can be really threatening, because sometimes people are really struggling to figure out how to be visible enough to be partner, or they're trying to decide if they want to or not, but can get really stuck in this feeling of like, I got two choices. I think also this experience of, especially in certain places and certain firms, feeling racism and discrimination pretty proactively, really seeing very, very differential treatment, intense competition, and really feeling that there's no camaraderie. A lot of intense competition can really trigger it. This idea of overwork, which I talked about, very strict hierarchies where, your first year, your second year, there's no kind of like real clear like understanding of who, these experiences are very, very rigid, and like you either go here, you go here, you go out. There's not a lot of flexibility, and sort of, malleability to the career roles can be very triggering as well, because you feel like you have to perform in a very exact way to get to the next place. And I think also too, the idea of the importance of a sponsor or a mentor, and even though some people can be assigned mentors, the way that they're treated, it can be very different, and like, so for example, when I've heard from clients when they've been assigned mentors, the mentor only meets with them on the designated time that they're supposed to meet, but they see their colleagues meeting with their mentors whenever they want, and going to golf and going out and meeting around, but their mentor meets with them only during formal hours, their monthly meeting. And so they realize there is another level, but the mentor won't let them in like that, because they don't see them in that way. They don't see them as the future of the company. They don't see them as the future of the firm. They don't see them as a future partner. And so their investment is very much lessened. And this can be very triggering, because you can think there's something wrong with you. What is it about me that makes them not want to invest in me? But there can be all kinds of reasons why they're not investing in you. Some of them racially related, some of them affiliation related. There can be all kinds of reasons. And then also the difficulty in changing areas of practice. So, there is a lot of difficulty. Your field has a lot of really like growing to expertise, but a problem with some people oftentimes feel like, I don't want this expertise anymore. Switching can be very, very difficult, and can make you feel like a fraud, make you feel like you made a mistake. What's wrong with you? How could you have gone in this direction? Can really be difficult, and can really diminish confidence and diminish any feelings of the fact that you belong anywhere. And so also too, I want to talk a little bit about bosses. So bosses and managers can be also very triggering. So here's a couple of different archetypes of bosses that can be particularly triggering. So the perfectionistic boss, is very much micro looking at every single detail. Anything you do wrong, they're not necessarily interested in complimenting you for the overall experience. They were like, there was a mistake on that slide. That was embarrassing. They're very much caught up with the detail, caught up with the mistakes, caught up with reinforcing perfection. An insecure boss is one that is really uncomfortable with their position. And as a result, they're very caught with you performing on their behalf. So, in essence, they're the ones who are feeling like, you have to represent me well, but they're doing that because they're not so secure in their own experience of their role. The erratic boss is one that is like looking at you one minute like you're amazing, the next minute like you're a fool. There's a constant like fluctuation with how they see you, how they deal with things that can be very sort of erratic and difficult to manage. There's also the prove it to me boss, the boss who's like, every time is like, you need to show me that you can do this. Even though you've done it 10 million times before, they're constantly trying to get you to show them that you belong here, that you're good enough. And then the withholding boss, that's a boss who is either not giving you any feedback or giving you very, very minimal feedback. And for imposter syndrome, that causes you to chase them for feedback in the sense that you want to just do better, more, you just want to really show to them that you deserve oh, that was good. That you get the littlest compliment from them, that feels like really good. And so that's the withholding boss. There have also been pandemic period triggers that I want to talk about a little bit. So this idea of adjusting to new methods of working and living can be really difficult in general, but I think also can be difficult when you have imposter syndrome, and like boundaries between your work and personal life are often blurred because you're wanting to kind of prove yourself, show that you're good enough, show that you belong. So it can be even more difficult when there is actually no way to go home because you are home. I think also additionally, the concern about the stability of your job or the stability of being able to keep it during the pandemic when people weren't sure sort of economically or still aren't sure economically how people are doing also put pressure on it. I think the pressure to overwork also is there. And then also, like I said, not being able to set boundaries in particular in traditional ways. I think the overload of everything emotionally people have been dealing with, and both, personally through work, through all these other ways, even though just the pressures of having to be at home have affected concentration and efficiency. And yet, there is no sort of accommodation for it in general in a lot of places. And then BCG did this report recently that showed that women are carrying greater loads of household and childcare duties of up to like 15 hours a week. Additionally, so there can be all these other additional pressures that didn't exist prior to the pandemic that now exist, but yet you still need to perform at the same level. So I think all of these things can also be adding. So when Richard and I developed the book, one of the things that we really wanted to do was actually create a program that actually helped you to move from point A to point B, to kind of go from this place with imposter syndrome where it feels like it is overwhelming, it is pretty, kind of all encompassing. When you get triggered, you just fall into that overwork habit and there's no way out. So what we did was we looked at the research over the last 40 years and looked at any significant trends in the research around sort of what moves the needle on imposter syndrome. And there were some really significant pieces. There are parts of our model, and then there were gaps. And so in the gaps, when we did a qualitative review of our practice and looked at the people with imposter syndrome and started to kind of understand what helped them move from where they were when they walked through the door to where they were when they left. And so we added those particular steps amidst that. And I'm going to walk you through all of that. So now we're going to we just talked about all the things that it does to you. And now we're going to talk about how to begin to intervene on it to make it different for yourself. So in the first phase, clarify, it's really about, knowing your imposter syndrome origin story, really being able to understand where did it come from, and then also being able to kind of identify that, because the importance of that is that the origin story begins to kind of then tell us why the triggers are currently what they are. Whatever happened that set the tone for this is why you are currently, where you are with the particular triggers. And that's why that we get to know the origin story first. Then we move to this place of like changing the narrative. And so with changing the narrative, the experience is really going from a narrative of reinforcing the imposter syndrome and being able to kind of deal with this idea of like thinking about yourself as a fraud, to being able to recognize your successes, your achievements, your accomplishments. So in terms of origin stories, in the book, we talk really in depth about origin stories, and we talk a little bit about family histories and dynamics, and we really get into it pretty in depth. But I'll give you some initial indicators of sort of what sets up, imposter syndrome. So early on, we often get stuck in these childhood roles. There are a couple of them that are very common for imposter syndrome. Either you were the intelligent one, you were the one who everyone thought like was naturally gifted, really, things came really easy for you. So then anytime you had to work at anything, then it felt like you were a fraud. It felt like you were fooling everyone. Then there was the hardworking role. And so that's when you weren't considered necessarily the intelligent or smart one, but you're the one who knew how to grind. And you got things done by putting grit and effort into it at everything. So as a result, you never got to see your natural strengths. You never thought of yourself as naturally gifted or strong at anything. You thought everything comes from intense hard work. There is no exception. And then those are the two that are covered in the research. I think for the third one, Richard and I when we were looking at it, we were like, these don't cover everyone we've ever seen in our practice. There's a third type. And that third type was the survivor type. And I think for us, we noticed there were two There are certain people that don't fit in either of those roles neatly, but there's another experience where in your household, there wasn't a parental figure that was telling you either you were intelligent or hardworking. There's a lot of absence. Sometimes there was abuse or neglect. And this experience then was that all your achievements, all your hard work was about getting out, was about achieving in a way to kind of get out, to move beyond what you were currently experiencing. And it never felt like anything more than that. And so as a result, oftentimes you feel like, one wrong move, one wrong step, and everything could go away. There are also other family dynamics that are at play, including anger and conflict that wasn't well managed in the family. And oftentimes you felt like you had to do a lot of the people pleasing and the kind of getting people back together or mediating situations. Also, ideas of very strict rules, families that were very, what we consider closed. There's not a lot of permeability to the family, but very strictly closed and very strict rules about how to behave, how to be, that had to be followed or else there were consequences. Also a high need to please others. So getting caught in these dynamics around pleasing other people and making sure that you were, even as a student, as a child, being pleasing to others and making sure you were doing the right thing. And then also no complexity in seeing people. Once you got stuck in a role in your family, typically you didn't get to vacillate off that role. You were that. No matter if you had other evidence that you were something else, you were always being, kind of put back into that role that you are this. So the reason we look at the origins is because we want to be able to identify triggers for your imposter syndrome. Recognizing the trigger allows you then to connect it to whether or not it's part of your imposter syndrome or not. And then being able to recognize it's part of your imposter syndrome allows you then to pause. And that pause is probably the most important piece. So being able to recognize the trigger and then take a moment to stop, and then really decide what behavior do you want to engage. So that allows you to do something very different with the trigger than you used to. So for example, you're assigned a new project, you're given, a presentation and you hate public speaking, you have a group project and you hate group projects. One of the things you want to do is start to look at sort of what are your triggers and then what are the common themes among your triggers. So for example, it might be public speaking. It might be authority figures that have a blank response to you. It might be managing a team. What is it that specifically is triggering you? And then begin to think about, from the themes, you then pull out the triggers: public errors, withholding, mentors or advisors, things that I can't control. That helps you to begin to then figure out, oh, this falls into one of the categories of my triggers. What am I going to do here? Do I just kill myself and spend 100 hours on this project, or I think about something very different in this moment? So I'll give you an example. For example, oftentimes, with imposter syndrome, we tend to do things alone and know how to power through things. And then as a result, we often think, oh, it takes much more time for me to delegate this and inform someone how to do it than doing it alone. But that's not necessarily true. That's something we tell ourselves. Sometimes taking the time to teach someone how to do something empowers you. Yes, maybe in the beginning, there's a bit of a time load, but in the future, then you can always assign it to them because now they know how to do it. So really getting an understanding of, like, we don't always have to do the same behaviors, even if we are so grooved by a particular trigger to always behave in the same way that reinforces our imposter syndrome. So then the third piece of this is really thinking about your narrative. So the third piece of this particular phase is really thinking about your narrative. In thinking about it is thinking about the language that you use to talk about yourself, talk about your accomplishments, talk about your skills that keeps you filled with self-doubt, maintains your imposter syndrome. You're trying to move to a narrative that bolsters your confidence, then frees you from imposter syndrome. In the beginning, that feels very much like you are lying to yourself. You're telling yourself, truths. You're like not necessarily being accurate, but actually oftentimes these ways of talking to ourselves in a positive way are much more accurate than the negative things that we tell ourselves. We just have come to believe that the negative things are true. So it's really learning to kind of watch the languaging that you use when you talk about yourself, your skills, your experience, the way that you performed something, and not getting into habits that really reinforce and language that really reinforces the narrative that you are an imposter. This narrative also often is like negative beliefs about your success, distortions about your story. You often feel like, oh, I was just lucky. Nobody else wanted the role. You tell yourself all kinds of things that really reinforce the narrative of that I am an imposter, I am a fraud. And it's just a matter of time before I get found out. To change your narrative, you really have to get in the habit of acknowledging your achievements, which we're really bad at. We hate taking compliments. We hate doing the work to kind of internalize achievements. Identify the distortions in your story, work to change them and add complexity and richness and thickness to the stories, and claim a much more positive perspective about ourselves and our accomplishments. Part of thickening the narrative is identifying that thin, accepted imposter syndrome narrative, and then challenging the premises of that original story, and adding complexity and accuracy to the story, and embracing and internalizing that more accurate and positive narrative, which takes time, takes commitment, takes consistency, but can be done if you're committed to it. So here's a thin narrative, and move to a thickened narrative. So the thin narrative is my sibling's the intelligent one and I'm the hardworking one. The premise to be challenged is like, you can only have one role in the family, or there's only one way to be perceived as intelligent. Maybe the thickened narrative is my sibling and I are both intelligent. We have different learning styles, and I may need more time, but that doesn't make me any less intelligent. We are both, have different styles of learning. So really being able to thicken a narrative and give it some richness, give it some kind of depth, challenge these premises that are not necessarily accurate or true, but have just been commonly told to you or told to yourself now in these ways. So a thickened narrative typically has positive characteristics, has accuracy and complexity, and consistently counters distortions and thin narratives. For example, narratives like I need to constantly overwork to show that I'm competent, or I'm a fraud and my accomplishments are tenuous, like at any moment they could fall apart. Like challenging these concepts, and that we often don't tell other people that we're dealing with, but we know we're having them. So the second phase is really choosing. So it's this idea of choosing to speak the truth, choosing to silence your automatic negative thoughts, and valuing and caring for yourself. So speaking the truth is really about both acknowledging really concretely your accomplishments, skills, and experience, and really outlining that to yourself and really clarifying that for yourself. Because oftentimes some people with imposter syndrome will say, I don't know what my accomplishments are, but really learn to catalog them and take account for them. And then also learning to share your experience of imposter syndrome with trusted others, and not to keep it to yourself anymore. Like I said, in the beginning, if you walk away from with one thing, community is central to this experience, and that not keeping this silent anymore and to yourself is so important. Then it's about defining ants. So ants are automatic negative thoughts. They're the thoughts that are triggered by those moments that we talked about, the new event, the high profile project, and they come into your consciousness, especially when you're triggered, and then they diminish your confidence in your abilities. This is an example of some of the ants that are commonly seen. I'll talk through a couple of them. For example, a mind reading ant is when you believe you can interpret what other people are thinking about you. So you see somebody with an ambiguous, unclear response to you, and as a result of that, you interpret they're thinking something negative about you. And then you get really concerned about their evaluation of you. A fortune telling ant is when you don't know what's going to happen in the future, but you try to predict it and clearly it's always usually negative. You're trying to predict that something negative is going to happen in the future. Catastrophizing ants, when you consider the worst case scenarios, when you're dealing with outcomes, like what could possibly happen. You're like, oh, this bad thing could happen, or that bad thing could happen, or this bad thing could happen. Those are considered catastrophizing ants. Unfair comparison ants are when you set unrealistic or unfair standards. You compare yourself to somebody who you shouldn't be comparing yourself. If you're a first year associate, you're comparing yourself to like a fifth year. You want to compare yourself to people who are kind of in those similar kinds of experiences, or not compare yourself at all and be able to see the unique experiences and value that you add. Also discounting positive. So someone says something positive to you, and then you're quickly to be like, well, no, there was a mistake in that, or no, it wasn't as good as you thought it was. You didn't see the background to it. And then also to this dichotomous all or nothing thinking. So engaging in like, either it's great or it's awful. It's, this black and white thinking that doesn't allow you to see the beauty and the thickness of the gray. Part of dealing with these thoughts is really recognizing this amazing quote by Amit Ray that I love, that you are not your thoughts, you are the observer of your thoughts, and really learning to recognize just because they're your thoughts doesn't mean they're true. And so really learning to challenge thoughts that don't benefit you and don't lead you to good places for yourself, because ants need a counter argument. You have to be asking, where is the evidence for that thought? Might there be another conclusion? Are there people that I can trust that might provide an alternate point of view? The next piece is really dealing with self-care. So oftentimes when we have imposter syndrome, we are the worst at caring for ourselves. In the priorities list, we are always bottom. We are whatever gets left over, we get that little scrap of time. And so here is just a chart of some of the self-care that we typically talk about. Physical self-care, which is the body, not only exercising and taking care of the health of the body, but also releasing the stress and tension that is within the body, that is carried in the body. They often say the issues are in the tissues. And so recognizing that your body also contains your stress and that is a part of your self-care. Mental self-care sort of involves engaging in active problem solving, attempts to understand the issues that may be coming up for you and what to do about them, which include like therapy, journaling, coaching, talking with mentors or peers. And then reflective self-care, the idea of being present and in the moment, things like meditation, mindfulness, religious practices, activities, gratitude exercise, all of those can fall into those reflective self-care activities. Valuing your self-care means creating consistent structure and consistency to your practice, that you are doing this regularly, that even if you have to schedule it, it gets rescheduled, but that you value it and it is embedded in the way that you live. And to not be perfectionistic. It's not about sort of like, I want to do 40 minutes of meditation. So as a result, if I can't do 40 minutes, I do nothing. It's about like, okay, if I can afford 1 minute, I'm going to do 1 minute of meditation and I'll work my way up to something more, learning to not be perfectionistic about the self-care processes and really attending to changing needs, recognizing that what you may need today may be different than the self-care you need a year from now, and really being adaptive and really recognizing that sometimes you've got to play with new self-care techniques to find out what's working when something has stopped working or stopped giving value. The last phase is create. And so in that place, we're creating new ways of being, which we've already started to do, but we're creating community and doing other things around sort of the way that we show up in the world. So the first phase is really about sort of the roles that we take up. And so oftentimes these are the typical roles people take up and with imposter syndrome. They often are the super person, they're coming to the rescue. They never say no. They want to always raise their hand as the helper and make sure that if someone needs something, they're there. They often very much also avoid failure and don't want to take the kind of risk that would expose their fraudulence or their perceived fraudulence. Oftentimes will lead from behind and feel very comfortable as a knowledge hub, someone who always knows the answers. But what you want to experiment with is with these new roles, ideas of learning to take a calculated risk, learning to be someone who also seeks help and not just is giving help, learns to kind of be in the front of everything and be a visible leader who gets good at collaborating with other people and working on teams and using the power of teams, and also can receive knowledge and not feel like receiving knowledge is some kind of explanation or show of like your incompetence. I think also too, for like your dream, the next piece is really having community. And when we talk about community, we talk about, in the book, we talk about like having a therapist, having a coach, all of these things are important, but also to having like some dream team community members. So somebody who, who understands imposter syndrome and can be an imposter syndrome expert, a good solid mentor that is not just someone who's for validation, but also helps you understand the career ladder, also helps you to kind of, connect with you and build community. Also can be somebody that you mentor at some later stage of your career, right? You never know if you stay connected to a mentor long enough, eventually you can be helpful for them. A cheerleader, somebody who roots you on all the time and always has good things to say about how you show up. The big picture person who always can see the full lay of the land and doesn't let you get caught in the myopic moment. An action planner, somebody who really knows how to help you do or take the next step. And a grounder, somebody when you're spinning knows how to put your feet back on the ground. So all of these community members are so important to really resolving your imposter syndrome because so much of it we do alone. And then the last piece is conditionals for optimal performance, sort of knowing that after you develop all these tools, it takes practice to be able to combat this over time. And you have to commit to wanting a different way of life. So really holding on to those skills and tools and knowing that it is an ongoing process, that you will be working on this, for a while, and that's okay, that it took 20, 30, 40, 50 years to groove this, and it's going to take some time to ungroove it and to give yourself that time to do that and to know the difference between a lapse and a relapse. You can fall back into your imposter syndrome, but if you remember your tools, it will just be a lapse. It will be a momentary lapse as opposed to a relapse. And you just say, well, forget it. I'm always going to have this. It's always going to be like this. And you're going to have a relapse and let go of those tools and sink back into your imposter syndrome. But building the tools and using them over time will make them easier to use and they will become second nature. So what's your action plan? So your job is to kind of figure out what got you started, what got you into your imposter syndrome, what happened in your early experiences, and be able to figure out, audit your self-care and figure out what can you be doing in your life to create really stronger, better habits around your self-care. Examine the relationships in your life. Do they reinforce your imposter syndrome or do they support change? Be conscious of your triggers, take a step back and choose a different behavior, even if it feels scary. Counter your automatic thoughts. Like, just because it's your thought doesn't mean it's true, and really learning to challenge that idea. Try new roles, stretch outside your boxes of imposter syndrome, and build a dream team around you. And I'll end with Sonia Sotomayor's quote: every little step you take, you're walking with a lot of other people. You're walking with me. You're walking with your friend who dragged you here today. You're walking with all the people here who have done the same thing as you are doing today. And the most important thing is you don't keep it inside of you. So I really hope that you remember that you walk with all of us and that we walk with you, but don't do it alone. And these are the places you can find me. So.
Thank you so much, Dr. Orbe Austin. We have a lot of good questions for you that are on deck. I just wanted to quickly pivot for a couple of minutes to our HNBA officers, Jacques and Angie. I just wanted to give you both of them a chance. Jacques, we'll start with you first, and then I'll do like a time check to make sure we get to these questions and give Dr. Orbe Austin, some time to kind of digest them and respond in kind. So I'll start with Jacques Quiles. If you wanted to, I thought I'd start with you just because I think in our initial conversations planning this, I think you also offer some insight about imposter syndrome, not only from a BIPOC perspective, but also as a member of the LGBTQIA+ community. So I want to just turn the floor to you to weigh in.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Aisha. It's great to be able to put a program like this together, and I'm really excited that we're having this conversation. So I just want to put out there, I'm Jack, I use they, them pronouns, and I kind of am speaking from the perspective of I'll just give a little bit of background about me. I was a prosecutor in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office for about 4 years. And I started that soon out of law school. So, you graduate, study for the bar, and then about 6 months later, I was hired by the office and went through the normal, experience of starting from the bottom essentially and working your way up the hierarchy and grinding your entire way. And I will say that luckily at the time we had the late DA Ken Thompson, who had made a pointed effort to recruit, a more diverse group of, assistant district attorneys. So my group, although we were small, did have a lot of people of color, but we didn't have, especially in the public sector, is you don't have as many LGBTQ people. At the time, I identified as queer. I wasn't out about being non-binary. And, in joining the office, I think all those things hold true where you're not around people who are like you, even though I was recruited in a class that had disproportionately more like Latinx people because, at the time you had the now DA Gonzalez was kind of like part of the recruitment. So he also, made a pointed effort to get as many like Latinx attorneys recruited, but there's still a lot of, we were still very underrepresented within the whole office of about 500 attorneys plus 500 administrative staff. And so going into that space, I would just say that I was never like that loud queer who like had the rainbow flags and like, was coming into, I don't know, like I just was never like that outspoken about my identity. I didn't really put it out there that much. And what ended up happening to me is I kind of became, for a lack of better terms, like a little bit more radicalized, or like I was really a lot more out front about my identity because it was so severely lacking representation within the field of criminal justice within the office itself. So there was a lot of tokenizing, but also me wanting to step up because LGBTQ, particularly people of color, are criminalized and targeted by the criminal legal system, whether it's for sex work or even just, disproportionately killed and abused by police. So knowing all of that history in the office, I saw that there was like this big gap. But when you're in that space, it's like, I wanted to fill a space and then quickly became the go-to person to answer all the questions, right? So you have to figure out what sort of boundaries am I comfortable, where I have prosecutors, I have people asking me things about hormones and stuff. I'm like, I'm not a trans person. First of all, why are we talking about hormones is completely inappropriate, but being that person, I had to figure out the sort of boundaries that I was comfortable with. And I cannot stress enough the importance of community, that even within that space, trying to find colleagues who can be an ally to me and really seeking that allyship and holding them accountable to that allyship so that they can be better. When you find, so I had a coworker who was raised in a more conservative setting, but was very open-minded, that I was able to lean into for support when things were difficult for me. And also, and also calling them out if they ever did say something ignorant, and doing it in a loving way so as to create the support that I needed. But also having very strong support from my friends so that I didn't feel crazy. But I would just say that I dealt with situations where I had somebody in a leadership position. We had a case where they were having a hard time believing the victim because the victim was a closeted, older, Black, Caribbean person who was possibly in a relationship with a man. But if anybody knows any older people from a Caribbean community, or they are not going to say that they are gay or that they're with somebody, they will not admit to that at all. So advocating for a victim in doing this, I had a supervisor yell at me and say, how can anybody not be out? This is the 21st century. And I'm sitting there heartbroken because I dated people who have been thrown out of their homes. I've been threatened to be thrown out of my home. Most of my friends are not out with their families and have to live double lives. And these are very real. We still have 40% of homeless kids or LGBTQ, majority of them being kids of color, being thrown out of their homes, who have to resort to sex work and stuff. And I have, this rich white lady saying to me that they should be a model for their community and come out about being gay. And that moment was very, very difficult for me. I actually left the office and cried in my friend's office, just how could somebody believe this and say that to my face? And so having somebody to go cry to was the thing. And then figuring out, okay, who's my ally in the office that can come back to me and hold this person accountable for this aggressive, horrible, ignorant comment that wasn't really a comment, and doing that hard dialogue where I had a white ally actually join me and confront that supervisor. And we had to break down how problematic and what that means. And that required out of me opening up about my personal experiences and the experiences of people that I love and hold dearly. So the imposter syndrome part about being, I guess, the minority within a minority, if you want, or holding multiple marginalizing identities and recognizing how that positions you, and just accepting that it's okay to feel, and you're not giving power to whoever is ignorant towards you. You're not giving power to them by acknowledging your own feelings within a safe space, and trying to suppress those feelings and trying to not acknowledge that would be, I found to be less helpful, because then I would have never held the supervisor accountable for saying such a horribly ignorant thing that was actually very damaging to the case and very damaging to the individual's life. So I I just like to say that it's still the same strategies of grounding in community, grounding in allyship, and having, you know, your own, literally reminding yourself every day, because I literally will have to remind myself every single day, multiple times a day, that I deserve to be where I am. And now I'm an attorney. I work at the Vera Institute of Justice, where I advise district attorneys on how to do their job across the country. And I was a prosecutor for a little less than 4 years. So, you know, understanding, and I'm talking to prosecutors who are often cis, straight, white people who are older and internalize a lot of this white supremacy. And I will say that my affirmations, my Instagram is like full of affirmations, because the world really does want you to feel like you're crazy, like you're different, and like you're not worth anything. And like that, I will also say that within the prosecutor's office, it did get to a point where I was having panic attacks. I would have to leave work early because I was having a panic attack and literally could not function. And accepting that reality and giving myself the permission to say, no, I really do need to leave. I know I have a caseload. I know I have this, that, and the third, but my mental health and my mental health is manifesting itself in physical symptoms, where I'm constantly have like racing heart, racing thoughts, and all these things. You're not doing anybody any favors by continuing to stay in that space. And so it took doctors and it took therapy to put me in a better space, but you kind of owe that to yourself, because I actually found that once I started doing that, I found my fortitude and I started doing a lot better, and I wouldn't be in the position I am today if I didn't do that work.
Jack, thank you so much for that testimony. For full disclosure, I'm like proud to hear you. Jacques is a former student of mine at Hofstra Law School. So sorry, I'm like, getting a little emotional right now, just like hearing you and just seeing you just speak your truth and your testimony. And so grateful to have known you as a student and just to see where you are now and to be able to partner with you on this. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. I much appreciate it. Angie, do you want to weigh in now with a little bit, and then I'll get to questions. I just want to kind of be mindful. It's about 7:20. So I also want to make sure I get some of these questions in for Dr. Orbe-Austin.
Yeah, I mean, I can briefly introduce myself and share some thoughts. So I'm Angie Freeland. I'm a fifth year at W. Boyce and Plimpton. So a little bit of background about me. I moved to the United States when I was 12 and didn't know any English. And I think from the start, being in middle school in the suburbs of New Jersey is really hard for any teenager, let alone someone who doesn't know English. And I kind of just learned to just be quiet and sit there quietly and pay attention and try to absorb as much as possible. And I was always very uncomfortable speaking up, sharing my thoughts, even if I knew the answer. I was scared of being criticized. My English was not going to come out perfectly. I was not going to think of the right word. And it kind of just perpetuated my entire life. And now as a mid-level in big law, it shows up in different ways, right? If I'm dialing into a call, I like to stay on mute and I don't introduce myself right on and tell people that I'm on this call. And it becomes difficult, I think, as you get older, because you don't acknowledge that you are learning all of these things, that you know way more than you think. You know the client, you know what you're talking about, you're the one doing the work. So of course you should feel comfortable to speak up during that call if you know the answer. What actually happened and helped me a lot was a partner was like, I hate it when you do that. You should introduce yourself. You're the one doing the work. You should take credit for the work. So when you dial in, it's like, hey, this is Angie, from Double Voice. I'm here. And she was the one that really encouraged me to start speaking up, taking the lead on calls. And it's really scary to put yourself out there. But I think when you do it, you start doing it in small doses, right? Like you start getting practice and you start getting better at it. So I volunteer for trainings and I give trainings. I If I know that there's going to be a call where something might come up, right, I kind of prep myself in advance. If that question gets asked, how would I answer it? So I would definitely encourage people that I think as you get older, be confident in what you know, and don't be afraid to speak up, because somebody else might do it instead, and it might still be the right answer, but then that's a missed opportunity for you to really put yourself out there, and get a little bit of practice in that sense.
Thank you so much, Angie, for offering a perspective from the private sector side of things. So I'm going to dive into some of the questions. I'm going to do my best in the time that we have. Hopefully we could hit all or as many of these questions as possible. I'll start with the first one that came in that came in towards the beginning of our conversation. Dr. Orbe Austin, what do you recommend for people who are dismissed or have rude things said to them by those who clearly display imposter syndrome? People don't want to work with them, they're uncomfortable around them, but yet no one takes them aside privately to have a discussion with them to kind of call them out or, point out, I'm sure in a gentle manner, hey, what's going on here? So the cycle of inappropriate and rude behavior continues, and it deemed acceptable by that person with the imposter syndrome. Should there be a way to address people who routinely display inappropriate behavior as a result of their own imposter syndrome?
I mean, I think it's also hard sometimes to know whether they're dealing with imposter syndrome or they're just nasty, right? Like there might just be really inappropriate and really not be. And I think you don't want to use imposter syndrome as an excuse to treat people poorly. I think that's really problematic. And I think what I often say is if you're looking to address something with somebody, there are so many factors that matter. Their seniority, sort of where they are. And I think you have to think about sort of dealing with it strategically. And so I would never deal with these things alone. Typically you want a coalition build and think about sort of like, who do you need to address this with? Who is going to be a person that can intervene? Is it your manager? Is it your mentor? Is it HR? But I think don't do it alone. Do it with if a lot of people witness this, then do it with a coalition of people who are sort of doing this so that you don't get scapegoated, because oftentimes by calling someone out, you can get scapegoated and that can have a significant implication for you, especially if the person's senior, a major contributor, or a major, person who brings in business to the firm. You could be in some serious you can put yourself in some serious risk. And so I think you really want to think about things strategically. I think you want a coalition build. I think you want to make sure that you do get it addressed, but you just want to do so in a way that is thoughtful and sort of has a community around it, kind of rallying to help you sort of support your process.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Another question that came in is, what if your community, I'm assuming the author meant like your personal community, family, friends, connection. What if your own community helps to perpetuate that imposter syndrome? And there are microaggressive situations that come from within your community.
Boundaries. It's about boundaries, right? It's about really being able to set sometimes, so it depends on who the community is, but if the community is like family or, you have to think about sort of like, how often do you need to see them? Like when you go there, do you feel better for you? Do you feel worse? If you feel worse, what are you doing? Like, you're doing an obligation. If that obligation makes you feel worse, what's the purpose of this? So I really think you have to examine sort of why you're doing what you're doing, like to stay connected to them. And then if you have to stay connected to them, how do you maintain some boundaries? How do you learn how to confront things where you can confront them and address them where you can address them? But really thinking about sort of like, what do you need to do? And I think, I'll teach you a little quick emotional boundary setting technique. It's like an imaginal one, which I really love. There's two of them. One of them is you imagine yourself with a door on your head. And then when you deal with the person, you close the door. And so you got to practice it, but it sort of helps you to realize I'm not going to take in sort of because sometimes you have to deal with these people and you don't have a choice. And so kind of working on this imaginal technique, there's also another technique where you kind of you get a shield. And so you imagine your shield and everyone's got a different shield. Some of my clients have like white glowing ones. Some of them have ones that are metal that go up like, so you have a shield. And before you go deal with that person, you put up your shield. And so thinking about ways in which you can actually protect, making sure that after you deal with these people, you're processing with somebody actively. So you have an ability to kind of express what's happened and you're not bottling it up inside, so that you have multiple techniques to manage boundaries and do it in a healthy way and really, find ways to take care of yourself. And it's okay to say, one of the things we're horrible with imposter syndrome is saying no. It's okay to learn how to say no and to recognize that people with healthy boundaries will accept no, and people without healthy boundaries won't, and they never will. And so it's really important to really practice some of this, but it takes time. And like Angie said, you do it in like baby steps as you get more comfortable trying it, and then try bigger things,
Okay. Another question that came in, this is a really good one. How do you know whether you have imposter syndrome or you just have low self-esteem?
Well, low self-esteem is correlated with imposter syndrome. So you could have low self-esteem and imposter syndrome. There is actually a measure you can take. It's called the imposter phenomenon scale. It's widely available. You can just Google search it and you can take it, and it shows you what level your imposter syndrome is. It was developed by Clance and Imes. And so you can go, it's freely available. You can go look at it and take it. And I think that would probably be the best way to determine whether or not that's what you're struggling with, a quick and easy way to do it.
Okay. What are some strategies for people who use self-sabotage as a coping mechanism?
Managing the performance anxiety. So the performance anxiety is inducing the self-sabotage. And sometimes the perfectionism is inducing the self-sabotage, but usually the perfectionism is connected to the performance anxiety. And so it's really about learning how to manage the performance anxiety and really learning, so I'm feeling anxiety. What am I going to do to reduce that anxiety? How am I going to emotionally regulate and modulate? And developing skills, whether it's meditation, whether it's mindfulness, whether it's physical activity, finding a way to kind of actually modulate the performance anxiety, and then develop task management tools, like use task management tools to manage the behavior around it. So for example, one of the tools I love that I talk about in the book is the Pomodoro technique. And so it's a technique often used with people who have ADD or ADHD to kind of manage time. And you set 10 to 25 minute timer. You work on one particular task for 25 minutes, then you take a break, and you do it no more than 4 times before you take a larger break. So you have to actually bring in structure to the process, and tools that help you to kind of not push things to the last minute, but intervene on it. The key piece is intervene on the anxiety and then intervene on the task management piece.
Okay. Thank you to Mary, who just wanted to share with everyone or remind everyone that if they have anxiety with respect to public speaking, they can Google Toastmasters near me and find a Toastmasters group that they can join. Looks like Toastmasters is they're still meeting on Zoom. So just as a supportive group in order to help with public speaking.
And I will also additionally add that with public speaking, one of the key pieces of developing skill around it is to continue, like Angie was saying, continue to public speak. It's the worst part of it, but you really just have to get a lot of practice under your belt and really, then really get good feedback potentially back. But it's really about like the more you do it, the less the fear decreases over time. So we call it exposure with response prevention. So the more you can get an opportunity to speak, the better it becomes over time,
Okay. There's a question that came in about, I think this might have had to do with the slide before you went into the triggers slide. So my apologies to Rachel if I am not asking this question in the proper context. She was asking if it was typical to fit into all of these boxes. It might have been different categories. I
think it might have been the family dynamics, the family roles. Yes, you can fit into all three or one or two of them. You can fit into multiple of the boxes. Yes.
Okay. All right. Got it, Rachel. Thank you. Let me shift to a question from the Q&A. Thank you all for speaking on this topic. I've been to many webinars and dialogues about this topic, and I found that many of the Black, Indigenous, and women of color speakers acknowledge that there is a trend of labeling these experiences as imposter syndrome, but indicate that they've never experienced it, and in fact believe that highlighting it is harmful for Black, Indigenous, and women of color, citing similar arguments used against affirmative action by BIPOC communities. I've also found this way of thinking to be prevalent in Black, Indigenous, and women of color in higher positions of power, who not only say that they've never experienced imposter syndrome, but have a queen bee, pick yourself up by your bootstraps mentality to success. Do you have any tips for meaningfully expressing imposter syndrome to these kinds of bosses? And thank you again. Finally, hearing this from a perspective that I align with is immensely valuable.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. I've had it. I mean, I've had it pretty intensely. And so I call it like clickbait. I think it's the new hot clickbait now of like oppression causes imposter syndrome. While oppression definitely does benefit from imposter syndrome and it does sort of reinforce it, it is not the cause of it. And it is prevalent in our communities and is significant and also has other emotional correlates. Like I was saying, the additional feelings of depression with perceived discrimination and anxiety that is heightened beyond sort of additional experiences for people who are not people of color. So I think for us to dismiss it and to act like it's not happening, I think is problematic. And so I think, it takes it reminds me of sort of the mental health stigma in our communities and people like, I don't have this. I don't know what people are talking about. The data shows that we do have it. And so I think it's really important to kind of recognize that somebody may not be in an identity stage to kind of be able to manage it or really come to an awareness of it, but it doesn't mean it's not happening. Maybe it's not happening for them. Some people it doesn't happen for, but I think it's not, I think, good for us to talk about it. And I actually think it's so important for people of color to talk about how this experience happens because it just further isolates. So there was I don't know if you all saw it, but there was a huge article that was super popular in HBR about a couple of weeks ago that said, stop telling women they have imposter syndrome. That article was garbage. I wrote a counter to it in LinkedIn because it actually had a lot of false information on there about pathology. There was a lot of falsehoods in it. It was very troubling that they would release an article like that. And I think it's really problematic because, I just told you that this concept is 40 years old and we are just starting to talk about it. We are just starting to deal with it and people are starting to come out. So the article that I wrote was stop gaslighting women when they tell you they have imposter syndrome, because this is hard to admit. It's hard. Like I thank Jacques and Angie for sharing. It is hard to admit this stuff, but it is so important we talk about it and we build community around it and we find a way to kind of overcome it so that we can own our greatness. The point of it is to own our greatness, to live in our competencies, our skills, our abilities, and to not have this for the rest of our life. But if we don't talk about it, we'll never get over it. We'll be stuck here forever.
I don't know if this is along similar lines. What do you do when you have another BIPOC undermining you in the workplace? How do you deal with that type of a situation?
Yeah, it's like what I call the crabs in a barrel situation. And so everyone's trying to pull their arms off, and crabs cut each other's arms off in a barrel. And I think it's really important to recognize the dynamic that may be at hand, that this may be a feeling like there can only be one of us that survives. I think that it's really important to not play into it and to really find other allies to support you in that experience and to not go toe to toe with them and to try to kind of battle this out. I think it is really important to find other allyship and to, it's sad. It's what they're doing is sad and it has a particular meaning. And I think it's really important to kind of not buy into it and not do it yourself. And to watch sometimes how organizations will pit you up against each other, because I have experienced that in organizations where there's another person of color. Actually, to be honest, I actually experienced it with my husband. We actually met and fell in love because my boss, he was a Black person in the office and she said he wasn't working and that he was lazy. And so, she got me to believe he was lazy. And she said, you need to watch him and make sure he does his job. And so I did. And one day he called me out and he's like, do you understand what's happening here? And he was like, she is actually pitting you against me to act like I'm lazy. I'm not lazy. I work harder than anyone in this office. I just don't do all the social things. So they think I'm not participating. And it was like, I woke up and I saw like what was happening and how I was participating in this like white supremacist dynamic. And we became friends. And I think that you have to watch in the ways in which the system is actually getting you to pit up against each other and to not play into it. And to really, if that person can't ally with you, then you find other alliances that don't allow you to get drowned in it. But I think it happens to us a lot. And so oftentimes, you can sometimes feel for the other person because they are being sometimes pit up against you to battle it out.
I'm going to just skip around a little bit. There's two questions I wanted to make sure I get to. One from looks like a 3L or 2L, and one that looks like more of from a pre-law student. I'll start with the current law student. Lately, I've been worried that after I graduate law school, I still won't feel successful or fulfilled. I worry I will need to accomplish another big, significant achievement. Is this a common fear of people with imposter syndrome?
Yes. And that's why I pulled the Sonia Sotomayor quote, because she said it was worse when her imposter syndrome was worse when she joined the Supreme Court. So I think it's in a great moment to show you that no matter what you achieve, it won't go away unless you deal with it head on. And you can get on this, what we call the achievement, like rat wheel of like, okay, then I need an LLM, then I need this, then I need that, like I need to go to this firm. It'll never stop it. It'll never be good enough. It'll never stop. And what you do, you have to catch it in its tracks and stop it right now, because you have to be able to be proud of yourself in this moment, in what you're doing now, because what you're experiencing can never be sated. And so you have to stop it. And so don't get caught in it, because you will never get off the wheel.
Another question. I am getting ready to take the June LSAT. Good luck to that person, wishing you success. I've started and stopped studying over the years, and I'm now enrolled in an online course where I felt a breakthrough in mindset, but had a family issue that took my time and energy for about 3 weeks. Now I'm feeling guilty about the time lapse. Do you have any tips about how to get back on track?
I mean, I would sort of see, I would, remember we talking about community. So you're in this class, the class is giving you a breakthrough. It's clearly doing good things for you, but ask your professor, do they think you're on track? Do they think you're ready for the June or July, whatever you had mentioned to say, or that do you need to postpone it again? But, get the feedback around sort of what the delay did to your performance and whether or not you're ready. Don't just take it because you signed up to take it. Take it when you're ready to take it, and that you feel like you're giving it its best shot, because you want to make sure you're prepared enough and you feel like, that, it's a good representation of your skill at the moment. So I think it's, or your ability to take the test. We all know what test taking is about. And so I think it's really important to kind of like, just ask for the assessment, ask for the evaluation about whether they think you're ready. And like, lean into the mindset breakthrough that you had, and lean into this community who's clearly like nurturing you and giving you something good that you haven't had before. But lean in and open up to them and ask for the support and feedback.
Along similar lines of getting back on track, for the imposter syndrome cycle 2, how do you deal with break the cycle of procrastination?
I mean, I think you've got to figure out, we talked about that before, that procrastination or self-sabotage can really be rooted in sort of like anxiety, and it can be rooted in perfectionism. You've got to figure out what is the procrastination really representing? Like, what are you afraid of? What's happening? Because it's usually something very meaningful. And if you can get underneath that and interrupt it. So what I love about the cycle is you can interrupt it at any point. And so I think you want to interrupt it before the procrastination hits, and think about sort of like how the performance anxiety may be affecting your procrastination, and interrupt it. So for example, if you get assigned a task and the idea is like, oh my God, I can't deal with that right now. I'm going to put it off. You need to deal with it right now. You need to create a schedule. You need to figure out how you're going to actually lay out the accomplishment of that particular task, because the avoidance of it only makes it worse and only makes the anxiety around it worse. So we talked about that, the delay, that procrastination, the self-sabotage, followed by the periods of overwork. Those overwork periods for someone with imposter syndrome are painful. They're almost physically painful, because you're feeling so much anxiety about hitting the timeline, hitting the deadline, that it just feels like a panic. You'll get it done, you'll do well, but it's a hard emotional place to be. And so I think you want to move away from that kind of work style and create like healthier work, like breaking up your work in a healthier manner, so that you can actually accomplish what you want in a very modulated way, emotionally modulated.
Okay. I did not understand what I was going through until more recently, that in fact it was imposter syndrome, but it's clear that it is something I've struggled with from high school through my present legal career. I kept thinking that it would get better with time and with more experience, but with almost 6 years of practice, the phenomenon is at an all-time high. In your professional experiences, is this common that it can get worse over time?
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah, it gets worse with usually greater visibility, greater promotion. The more you feel visible, the more you feel seen, the more responsibility that you have, both like in the workplace and at home, to kind of bring a certain salary or, thing home. Like, I think it gets worse because the pressure feels more intense. And so you feel like, yeah, now I can never screw up. And so I think it really is very important to tackle it. Like if you're feeling it now, like, go and tackle it, like go get the book, and do it, like do it with a partner. Like, it's so much better to do the book with an accountability partner. Do the book. We're seeing great results. We saw like a 30% decrease in the first cohort we ran through the book. Like it can change, and it can change fast, but you just got to commit to working on yourself and working on getting rid of it. But it is possible. I got rid of it. It was pretty, if you watch my TED Talk, you can see, I tell the entire story of what was happening, and I was in probably some really bad shape. And so I think it's really important to recognize you can get over it. You can get over it quickly, no matter where you are in your career, and it doesn't have to plague you for the rest of your life.
Okay. As an immigrant student who was personally affected by a family member's deportation, I found this trauma being triggered by certain concepts discussed in an immigration class. How would you recommend dealing with trauma like this before going into practice?
Go see a therapist. Like go see a therapist. Like, you're experiencing trauma. You have PTSD potentially from your experience of, watching your relative have to be deported. Like, either if you're a law student, oftentimes there are there's free counseling that a lot of people don't take advantage of. Like get in the counseling sessions while you can on campus, or, really seek support, because the trauma doesn't go away. You need to kind of address it and develop tools around managing it and handling it. Like it can be revolutionary to see a therapist. And I know in our communities it is very stigmatized. Like I remember the first time I went to therapy and my family was not happy about it. But I needed to, and I needed the support. And, like it was really important for me to do it. It was one of the best things. It changed the trajectory of my life. My therapy. I mean, clearly it made me into a professional therapist, but other than that, it really changed my relationships. It changed what I was doing in my relationships. It changed my life. So get the support you need. You'll never regret it, and sometimes you need to bounce from, you need to find the right therapist. You got to find a culturally competent therapist. So sometimes it can take one or two, but don't stop looking until you find a good fit.
And to that student, I agree. Please, echoing Dr. Orbe Austin's sentiments about finding the right therapist. It might take time. You might have to go through a couple of therapists before finding that right connection, that right. It's a relationship. It is. I'm saying that from my own personal experiences there, but also as a law school administrator, definitely check in with your school with respect to what counseling services are available. Check with your student affairs office. And also, depending on what state you're in, with your local bar association, every bar, like state bar association or municipal bar association, usually has a lawyer's assistance program that offers support, therapy and support services that are also available to law students. No matter what is going on, they're there. So I just wanted to also echo or just piggyback on that for a minute. I think we have a couple more questions. Why are some? I don't want to misconstrue Mary's question there. What about imposter syndrome when driven by, quote, if they only knew I did this in the past, could they still like me? I don't think so. This is a thought I know someone has, and I know it's true, but there's nothing I can say to convince them otherwise. I think it was like a comment question.
Right. I mean, I think that oftentimes there's this feeling of like, if you are like flawed in any way, that you don't deserve certain things, or if you've made a mistake, if you failed something, if like, you have some kind of checkered academic history, or like, you just feel like if anyone knew, or if anyone found out, like this idea that, then I would be complete, it would all end. I remember actually when I finished, as I was walking up the stairs of the library to deposit my dissertation, I happened to open it up and noticed there was a mistake in a chart. And I had this very panicky, very imposter syndrome moment where I thought about like actually not submitting my dissertation and having it redone and like having a rebound and like, because what I was thinking in the moment is, if they find this mistake, I'm going to lose my doctorate. And I was plagued by that feeling for years, that if they found that mistake in my dissertation, they were going to call, like, I was going to get a call from Columbia and they were going to say, we've taken your PhD away. And so I think it can be this hypervigilance about any mistake in your past, any difficult moment in your past, any kind of checkered history makes you not perfect. And I think it's really important to realize that we all are flawed. We all are human. We all have made mistakes. None of us is perfect. None of us is all good. We are mixed human beings. And it's really important to kind of appreciate that. And I think, I would encourage you to encourage your friend to seek some support and help, because that may be a deep therapeutic issue they need to kind of understand. So if they're close to you, to kind of encourage them to get help for that, because it doesn't have to stay that way. You don't have to continue to believe that about yourself forever, no matter what it is.
Okay. I have two more questions for you, and then I think we're at time. I definitely have imposter syndrome, but even though my boss is super understanding and kind in every way, he is a superhuman, super lawyer. It's so hard to keep up with his pace. It makes it so hard for me to not feel as such an imposter. He works 24/7, never makes a mistake. He does not demand that from me, but he unintentionally makes me feel like an idiot. Any advice?
Yeah, he's sort of the super person, right? So when we were talking about the roles people take up, he's like a super person. He's like a superhero. He's like larger than life. And I think what you have to recognize is that while you admire it, it's probably pretty interesting to watch. It's not something that you want to replicate. And so given the fact that he's okay with you not being like that, don't be like that, right? Like, he's not reinforcing it. He's not asking you to live like him or do like him. So I would encourage you to set your own boundaries, allow yourself to kind of be human in the process. And since he's good about it, I would actually consider it a practice of a technique to kind of really keep going there and being yourself, and knowing that that's not what you aspire to, because it's unhealthy to work 24 hours a day. And to be superhuman like that, it's probably having a cost to his life in some way, and that probably don't want those costs. And so it's okay for him to, remember we're talking about unfair comparisons. It's okay for him to be him, and for you to be you, and for you to exist in different worlds, and for both to be good. So really learning to differentiate yourself. There isn't only one way to be amazing. There are multiple ways to be amazing, right? And some of the ways to be amazing are human, flawed, mistake making. You can be amazing and make mistakes, so to really allow yourself humanity, and to really, luckily he's also human in that way, and to really allow yourself to be who you got to be, and respect him, but respect yourself too.
I know that was the individual's question, but that hit me in a certain way because I too, particularly when you said you could have your unique way of being amazing. You don't have to be someone else's amazing. And everyone's version of amazing is amazing. and it's okay.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Everyone has greatness. Everyone.
Exactly. The last question that I see in here, I'm a judicial clerk and I'm in a space where there's little to no room for error. So it is tough for me to feel like I am competent when I make little mistakes. Do you have any tips on how to deal when mistakes are made?
Yeah, it can be really hard in these precision related career paths. And I think it's really figuring out sort of like, how do you want to work? How do you work best in a precision mindset? Like, so, like if you're an architect, if you're a surgeon, there are certain places where mistakes are massively problematic. And so I think it's really thinking about, what are your optimal conditions for performance? Do you need to make sure that you get 8 hours of sleep? Do you make sure you need to take a lunch? What makes you perform at that high level? And then how do you take care of yourself outside of that? Like that you can't be, if that's perfection is expected because of the role, and because, because I think it's also worth sometimes checking those assumptions, whether or not perfection is really necessary. But some roles it is. And so I think in those cases, it's really about like really, really great self-care, and really learning to kind of take care of yourself in the places where you're not working, whether it's lunch, after work, that you have a full, robust life outside, that you work on cultivating that, because the pressure of the precision is intense. And so you really want to make sure that you also have other spaces in which you don't have to be perfect, when you can be human, and that you give a lot of yourself time to kind of cope between experiences of the precision and not having that, but it is hard. And then also, if it's not great for you, you want to maybe think about other options. Like if you're not doing well and it doesn't make you happy, like thinking about sort of, is this really a good fit for me? For some people it is, that they're great at being precise and that's what they love. But for some people it is not. And it's okay to kind of decide, like, work culture wise, this doesn't fit me,
this person, I apologize because this person had actually qualified their question with the extra comment. I think that's important to note, especially given that one of the judges that I work with told me I was a diversity hire. So it makes me feel like I was hired because I'm a diverse clerk and not because of my skills. I
feel very mad right now. And I think a lot of us feel mad because it's a setup, right? It's a setup to tell you, you don't belong here. So you have to prove yourself. You have to work a little extra harder because you don't really deserve to be here. I wouldn't believe that for a second. And it is racial gaslighting. And I think, I would encourage you to find community and support. I would find other clerks of color, even if they were former clerks of color, to find community around this, to be able to emotionally fight off this crap, excuse my language, because I think it is not healthy for you to kind of believe that and to kind of like work under those notions that you are a diversity hire. It is attempting to pressure you to perform at ways that are unrealistic because you don't belong there, but it's not true. You do belong. So find community, like find other clerks, find other judges, find other people who will support you. You'll find it, but look.
That's a frustrating one. Oh my gosh.
It happens. I hate it, but it happens.
I'm thinking of a disagreement that I got into on November 7th, 2020 with a friend, I guess former friend now, with a friend about a comment that person made about Kamala Harris being the new VP. And it's kind of like, oh, come on, like, this is like a token thing. She's a woman and a person of color. And I'm like, okay, so you really just came out there with that you just think that this person just blindly went into this, not knowing what she's doing. And, political strategy and all that. Everyone does it, but it just hurt. Like, so as I'm reading that, I'm like, oh, it just brought me back to that conversation where I jumped in there. Like, you can't say that type of stuff. You can't do that. So, and
you can't believe it. Like don't believe it. Like you succumb to it if you believe it. You succumb to the tools of white supremacy if you believe it. So don't believe it. Believe that it is the tools of the oppressor, and know that you are amazing and that you're only there because you're amazing.
Absolutely.
And find community.
Yeah. And find community. Yeah.
Thank you both so much.
Yeah. Jimmy, I'll turn it over to you to close things out.
Perfect. Thank you, Aisha. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Angie and Jacques, and everyone who's participating through the chat. These are conversations that we need to have. The H in HNBA stands for honest, and we're here for having these open, honest conversations about things that you typically can't talk about at work or in your law school. So this is healthy. And our purpose here is really to build community and opportunity, to build places where you can find people who understand. I myself, I'm not a judicial law clerk, but we're starting up a project to gather as many Latinx federal law clerks together because they can relate and understand certain issues that only come from being, working for one judge. It's different than being working at a law firm, different than working at a DA's office. Thank you, Jacques, for talking about the pressures that come as a prosecutor. I was a former prosecutor myself. I was a former juvenile defendant myself. And I'm sharing all this because there were no men on the panel. And I think to really destigmatize this, we have to be open about the fact that men can go through this too. Men should get therapy ASAP. I wish I got it 10 years ago. I started getting it when I was 30 and it was the best decision of my life. Definitely endorse BetterHelp. It looks kind of like startup-y, but there's some quality therapists out there. We're here to build opportunity. We're here to build community. And if there's anything that resonated with anyone here who attended, please reach out to us. We have an Instagram, we have Facebook. You can find Dr. Lisa on Instagram and Facebook. You can reach out to us anytime, shoot us an email. It can be anonymous, but if there's any topics or areas or issues that you want to see fleshed out in a program, HNBA is here, especially in the realm of virtual events. It takes a couple of emails and boom, you have a panel. So please get involved, stay involved, follow us on social media, and we look forward to seeing you at the next great event. But until then, please prioritize yourselves. The one thing that resonated that this diversity issue came up with, and this is something I'll talk about frankly, because I was dealing with that today with my therapist, was you always feel this pressure to represent your race, represent your ethnicity, especially in this space, right? and you don't want to fail in any way, shape, or form. Even one single mistake, obviously, we all know we have to work 3 times as hard as our competition. And you start thinking about, well, I want to represent my race. And the perfect response came back from a therapist. This is why you guys have to try it. She looked at me in the eye and said, well, what are you trying to represent your race to be? You want to represent your race proudly to do good work? Or are you trying to represent your race as a slave class and, you know, work head over heels for these people who are putting these pressures on you? And so you find these pressures and you find these issues, but you're not alone. And once you start talking to community, talk to therapists, talk to friends that go to therapists, and boom, you know, you put yourself in a different world. So please reach out, find help if you're dealing with some trauma, like some of these sad stories. Please, you know, you're not alone. HNBA is here and we're non-judgmental. Happy to connect you with other people. Happy to connect you with Aisha, with Dr. Lisa, with Angie, with Jacques, and a bunch of other deputies who are amazing and cover all the spectrum of career paths. So please don't be a stranger. And thank you very much. Everyone have a good night.
Have a good night, everyone.